John, let's begin with your name, where you were born, when you were born.
My name is John Frens. I was born in Grand Rapids on April 12, 1923.
I was born on April 11th, not 1923 though. What was your early schooling like?
Well, I attended local Christian schools here in Grand Rapids through Grand Rapids Christian High School. And I took a year off and then enrolled at Calvin College, local college.
What was your intention at Calvin? What were you going to try to become?
The real intention was that my mother and my sister wanted me to go to college to stay out of the war as long as I could.
You're looking at your schedule here. You're a year off of the Pearl Harbor. What was your reaction to Pearl Harbor?
Well, I remember it well, and of course it was inevitable that we were going to be at war. Many of my relatives and friends had already gone to service thinking that they would put in a year and be over.
Yeah. You mentioned about your mother and your sister. So when Pearl Harbor happened, you caught up in the fervor of this whole country that you wanted to go, but how old were you?
In 1941, I was 18.
So you were eligible, you could go.
Yes, and I'm sure I had some kind of a selective service identification, but I don't remember that exactly. Mm-hmm. It was not until we heard that a recruiting organization of some kind was coming through Grand Rapids, and on the day after Thanksgiving, which was a day off from school as far as I was concerned, I went and thought nothing lost to take the test.
So what was the next step? The test was for any branch of service? Did you have a choice of?
As I recall, it was only Air Corps, Army Air Corps.
Oh, okay.
And so then I was in school, and the question was asked, well, how long before we'll actually be called up? The promise was that we would complete the year of college that I was in, which in my case was only the freshman year. We got through the first semester, and we asked the same question. Oh, no, you'll stay on. But only about 3 weeks later, they called and said you have to go up, and we had to report to Chicago.
What was your mom's reaction to all this?
Well, I said that I think it's the best branch of the service. I didn't get drafted and just put in with anybody because we were, I feel, a more select group, if you want to call it that.
Right. So let's go through the process, since people don't really know how one gets into the Army Air Corps at that time. It should be noted that America did not have an Air Force at that time. It was Army Air Corps, Navy Air Corps, or Marine Air Corps. What was the process? You signed a paper? Did you get on a train to go somewhere? A bus? What happened?
Well, of course, once it was decided, then we all had to be sworn in. So I was sworn in officially in the Air Corps. I think it was December 11, 1942. And so I was called, and this call came in February 1943, and we had to meet in Chicago. So I took the train, and so happened a very good friend of mine happened to be on that same train, so we had a nice time going down because I just left my family.
This friend of yours was also in the Army Air Corps, was joining the Air Corps?
No, he was one of the very prominent architects here in Grand Rapids, Joe Daverman. And we didn't know, but we were both on the same train, so I had a pleasant conversation, not thinking about what I had left behind and what I was headed for.
Wow. So you arrive in Chicago, off of the train. What happens there? Where do you go? Is there a car to pick you up, or what happened?
No. We were given an address, and it turned out to be a big warehouse type of place. I'm not sure, but it wasn't too far from the train station. And we were young fellows, all like me, gathering there. They put us on a train, did not tell us where we were going, and the train seemed to go on and on and on. And finally, I realized we were in Florida, and we were going right down the center of Florida with a train track, nothing around on either side. In those days, Florida was nearly as built up as it is now. They were on the coast. We ended up in Miami Beach. Got off the train, and we were put up in hotels. The Army Air Corps had taken over all the hotels on Miami Beach. And we ended up, I can't even remember the exact name, but I know that my particular group, we ended up on the 7th floor of that particular hotel. They would not let us use the elevators, so we had to walk up and down, which was good exercise all by itself.
Now, forgive me, but Miami Beach, you're in your 20s, this is a bunch of guys. That must have been an exciting time.
It was. Actually, in the evening, we were permitted to leave, and so we'd go to the dog races or something like that. So it was a kind of a fun thing. And then during the day, we'd be marching around the streets of Miami Beach. We had our PT on the beach, and there were men as far in either direction as you could see. One guy was calling the exercises over a loudspeaker, and they had various platforms along the way where a guy would be in charge of it. But I can't even begin to tell you how many people I thought that were there.
Now, were you issued uniforms, or were you wearing boots? I mean, you're standing there on the beach. I'm picturing bathing suits.
Well, I think we wore shorts and a T-shirt, but no, we were issued the full gear. Well, as far as uniforms were concerned, they knew we weren't going to stay there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, other than calisthenics, what other training was going on?
Marching, military discipline of a sort.
Mm-hmm. No indication at this point about what part of the Air Corps you were going to be involved in?
No.
Okay.
Then, because many of us had been taken out of college, we were sent back to college. They had an Army Air Corps training detachment, I think they called it. I was sent to Columbus, Ohio, and sent to a small college, Capital University, out in a very affluent suburb of Columbus. And so we were assigned to, or sent to class, college class.
But what kind of college classes are we talking about?
Well, I can only say from my own experience that I happened to skip a class because at Calvin I had taken a course in physics, and my best thing was logarithms, and that's what they happened to be teaching in the math class, and that's why at the end of the first month, then they moved me up ahead of all of the buddies that I was with. I was supposed to be there 3 months, and I ended up being there 2 months because of my, most of the people that were in classes ahead had more college education. Eventually, I ended up with a buddy who had been at the Citadel, and he only had one more semester to go, and they still put him in this cadet training. It's really, he had a setback.
Let's get an idea, John, of the variety of men that were there. When you first came out there, you're from Grand Rapids. Now you're in Florida. Where were some of these guys from?
They were from many places. I know that most of the people that I became very familiar with were from the Southeast. They went to Wofford University or the Citadel. After we had been in Columbus for a very short time, why then one evening as lights were out and I was talking to the buddy next to me, his name was Hank Filstra, good Dutch name, and he was going to Hope College, and he was from New Jersey. So we became very good buddies.
It always amazes me how, especially amongst the World War II generation, when you start to realize this, guys who had never been outside of their small hometown, meeting people from all over the country. Now, of course, you travel, as much as you want, pretty much. But in those days, you were pretty much stuck in one place. But then the military expanded that horizon for you.
Right.
Was there any indication during the period of time you're referring to now the logarithms, you've skipped ahead to another class. Did you have any idea where the Army Air Corps was moving you towards?
No, because the next step was to go to Nashville, Tennessee, which was their classification center. In those days, almost everyone became classified for pilot training because that's what they needed the most. I don't recall, but my testing must have also included navigation or bombardiering or whatever. And so when I did not make it through the first primary class of flying, that then I had an option to go to navigation school and not become a pilot. And that was okay with me because I wanted my wings and my commission, besides getting some more academic training.
It's interesting. This is I've heard this, of course, many times with the Air Corps. There's this filtering system.
Yes.
You go from one place and then another place and another place, and eventually somebody is really actually knows what they're doing. They actually have this idea of, well,
right,
how to filter all these through. Now, you mentioned I'm sorry, go ahead.
Before I actually got into navigation, they gave me a sidetrack, and I had to go to near Fort Myers, Florida, and take gunnery school, which was part of flying. And so we flew over the Gulf between Fort Myers and Key West, and we had all kinds of gunnery type of activities, ground or air-to-air gunnery. And then from there, I came back to Selman Field for the actual navigation training.
Did you feel a certain affinity for navigation compared to being a pilot or being a gunner or anything?
No, I would have to say that I really didn't know in specific terms what was going to be involved, other than that the course took about 5 months.
So the war is already on.
Oh, yes.
In Europe and also in Japan. Amongst your group, was there any discussion about where you might end up or what you're going to be doing?
I don't think we really were all that concerned. We just, most of us in those days were anxious to get going.
Okay. Now, you completed training at some point
Yes.
at that stage. When did you find out that you were going to become a navigator?
Well, once they took me into the navigation training at Selman Field in Monroe, Louisiana, then as long as I continued to do well in the course, our scheduled graduation right from the very beginning was on May 20, 1944, because we were called the class of 44-7.
Okay.
May 20.
Where did you go from there?
Well, I went home for a few days, unfortunately, and then I was assigned to go to Lincoln, Nebraska, which was a distribution area, to find out where the need was for a person with a particular skill.
John, let's backtrack just a moment. I'm thinking about your mom. Your sister had some trepidation about your going off there. I'm sure they were concerned about your safety, etc. But when you came home in uniform, you had to come home in uniform, right?
Yes.
What was the reaction?
Well, they were very proud, and we had lots of pictures. And there was one very significant time, and that is, perhaps I'm a little ahead of the story, but when we knew we were headed for overseas, we had to travel by train to New York. On a Sunday morning, we came into Chicago, and I called my parents and my sisters here in Grand Rapids, and it was about 9 o'clock in the morning, and they were all dressed to go to church, but they came down to Chicago, and we spent a good part of the day together, and 3 days later, I was on the way to overseas.
Wow. So let's go back to when you actually found out that you were going to be going overseas. What was the process of being informed that you're going to the Pacific?
We had no things that I thought were indicating where we were going to go, other than that we were assigned to a crew. We had been training both in Pratt, Kansas, and in Clovis, New Mexico, and then they sent us up to Kearney, Nebraska, which was, I considered to be a staging area, and that's where everything necessary was issued to us. And then on the train through Chicago, and we ended up in New York. And there's a place just outside, I think it's on Long Island, called Fort Totten. And that was then where we were put on, just our crew was put on a C-46 and flew all the way across to India.
Let's backtrack just a moment. The training that you went through, you mentioned a crew. Are you saying that there was specific people that were assigned to a particular aircraft and you trained together, that whole crew?
Well, I wouldn't say to a specific aircraft. We were just a crew, a group of 11 fellows, 5 officers and 6 enlisted men. And we had B-29s, not one, whatever day there was a particular aircraft assigned, that's the one we would fly for our training, particularly in Kansas. And then we were not in Clovis, New Mexico very long, and I'm not even sure why we went there, other than that we continued to do about the same thing, except that most of the people were kept in Kansas because those B-29 crews were going to go directly to the Marianas. They must have had us without our particular knowledge, other than the pilot, that we were going to be sent as a replacement crew to the people that had first B-29s that had gone overseas, went to India.
Okay. Let's get an idea of what the crew consists of. And once again, I want to make sure I'm clear on this. You had the same crew as you
Yes.
trained, different airplanes and whatever, but wherever you traveled, it was the same crew, which built this kind of camaraderie amongst you.
Correct.
So give us an idea, the pilot, obviously a navigator because of you, but who else was on this crew?
Then we had a co-pilot, and we had a bombardier, and we had a flight engineer. Those were the 5 officers, and all 5 of us were up front in a B-29. Then we had 6 enlisted men. The radio operator sat in the same compartment across on the other side of a gun turret in the same compartment I was in. All of the rest of the enlisted men were in what we'd call the rear. And in the B-29, we had a long tunnel that we had to crawl through to get to the rear part of the plane, because the plane was pressurized. And so, therefore, the bomb bays were closed and had the bombs, but when the plane would be open to drop bombs, those would be open and not affect the pressurization. So that's why it was a very small area. In the back, we had, I think he was called the a gun control man. He sat in the upper turret, in the upper dome, but the turret where his guns were firing was right next to me. But he was way behind us, but he had particular sighting on his guns. There were 4 50 caliber machine guns in that particular turret. And then we had 2 side gunners who had a turret above, or a gun above them and a gun below them. And then we had the tail gunner who was in a compartment all by himself and could never get out because of the pressurization. So,
did you feel that you had adequate training?
I would say so, yes.
I mean, there's a certain confidence that comes with youth no matter what.
Right.
But, and there's a certain, I imagine, some competitive that, your crew's better than somebody else's crew or something like that. But did you feel like the training that you had there when you were ready to actually go into battle, did you feel like you guys were prepared?
The pilot that was assigned to us had been in the air flying for quite a long time, well before Pearl Harbor. So he had lots of flying experience, but he was a person that would deliver airplanes all over the world. He tells some stories about delivering planes to Persia or to China or India. And those guys over there, they'd jump in an airplane and wouldn't know how to fly, and he'd show them, but it was wild. But because of his experience, we were then, when we got overseas, we were assigned to be a lead crew. But it was because of his flying experience that we as a crew were all very confident. individually, it might have been a little bit different.
Let's let's describe and try and make it as visual as possible, because not many people know about the China, Burma, India theater as you and I do. You arrive in India,
Yes,
okay? You're arriving in a transport plane,
correct.
okay? For those people who have never stepped off an airplane into Asia, kind of describe for us, the door opens and you walk out, there's a smell, there's an environment, everything is completely different. If you can just, what happened when you guys got off the airplane?
Well, we had a very interesting flight in the C-46 and stopped en route in several places, but eventually we got to Karachi, and I think that's the most notable, because in Karachi they put us in quarantine for 30 hours to make sure we were not bringing any diseases into the country of India. Then after we were there for that period of time, then we were continued on to Kharagpur, which is about 60 miles southeast of Calcutta. So it was a good day's flight to get over there.
Well, once again, let's get back to the actual environment. You get off the airplane. Did you notice anything different? The smells or the heat or anything like that?
Well, the heat was very noticeable. I don't particularly recall smells. You know, it was all kind of awesome, you might say, and some of those experiences you're thinking of, we didn't really feel until we got, say, a weekend pass to Calcutta. Then we could see the poverty, the stench, the very poor physical conditions. We saw babies sitting on the street waving a baby with no hands, just waving the stubs of arms, beggars. You never heard so much bakshish in your life. And then we had to do training in that area. We had an island down in the mouth of the Ganges River that we bombed for our practice.
Where did you stay? Did you have barracks or did you have houses? What?
We had barracks with thatched roofs, and one room was for we had a room just for the officers of our crew, not the pilot. He was off somewhere else with higher ranked officers. He was a major. And then we had another group of barracks that were for the enlisted personnel. Mm-hmm. And then we'd, whatever appointed time the commander would say, we would meet at the airplane, and we were either flying or we were cleaning off the airplane.
Give us an idea of the size of the operation, if you will. You know, you're at a base, you're at an air base. Are people picturing one airplane sitting here, 3 airplanes sitting here? Are we the airport? I mean, what size are we looking at?
Down at operations, we had a building, of course, and then we had a runway with lots of hard stands where the B-29s were located, and that's where the maintenance people did their work. And size right at the moment, I couldn't really give you a good estimate.
Are we talking about 10 or hundreds of aircraft?
Oh, I would say if we had 20, we had a lot.
Okay. Now,
by the way, there were I think 3 or 4 other fields in India in that same general area.
Sure. What was your weekly routine like in the very beginning? Now, I don't want to move too far ahead yet, but when you first got there, you mentioned cleaning aircraft. You said, going out to the line, flying. What was your weekly activities like? Did you have 2 days off, 1 day off?
I don't think there was any special routine that we had. We went by the day because not all crews could fly every day, because we had fewer airplanes than we had crews. And that was particularly true in India because we lost a lot of planes and crews.
A lot of people who don't know that much about the CBI theater is that they were kind of at the tail end of the supply line, and that's another problem that you all had out there, is that you weren't getting the supplies that, say, some of the ones in Europe and whatnot were getting. Was there a sense of having too little to do too much?
That could have been. I'm sure that people who were in charge of the outfit perhaps would tell you yes, very definitely. But that wasn't in my area of concern, really.
Right, right. Well, when did you actually start to get into actual combat then? I mean, how long was it before you were actually sent out on missions?
Well, we arrived in India in November 1944, and I'm sure that before the end of November we were in combat.
Give us an idea of a particular day. It could either be the first one you ever went into combat, or just you get up at a certain time, where do you go, then you get into the aircraft, and then what happens? Give us an idea of what that was like.
Well, usually in India, the missions were, I think, all daylight missions. So that we'd be told what time to be down to the line, and then we'd have a briefing. And the people who had planned the mission would tell us all about it, and we'd get weather information. And if sometimes we'd be given then perhaps a couple hours before takeoff, which would, me in particular, would permit me to go back and pick up all my gear. I'm not sure if I was told to have it with me or not, but it took time for me to get organized, and then they would tell us what time to be ready for takeoff, and we'd all file one behind the other down the taxi strip to the end of the runway, and the tower gave the signal as to how far apart the takeoffs were. I don't remember that part of it. I was too busy recording various data.
Mm-hmm. Let's get an idea of what you were actually doing. Obviously, most people know a pilot, what he does, and the co-pilot, what he does. What were you specifically doing once you're in the airplane and about to take off?
I was responsible for supplying all pertinent data. What time we took off, how long it took us to get to altitude, or I also knew in India in particular, we always had a rendezvous point that happened to be up in the Assam Valley. I think perhaps that was at least 150 miles away. Up there, before we'd fly across the hump, we'd rotate, and the lead crew would put down their nose wheel, and that would be the plane on which all others would form for formation. And then we'd go over the hump to our base near Chengdu, China, Western China. I think they called it A7, I'm not sure. And that was far west in China, but we could reach Kyushu, the island of Kyushu, but we could not reach Tokyo from there.
I know what the hump is, but let me ask you, what was the hump?
The hump was, and I'm sure still is, the most difficult flying, perhaps other than Antarctica, the most difficult flying area in the world, because it's very difficult to see the ground. There's always lots of strong wind and then a lot of blowing snow with it. And if you had good instruments, you could get through. But the very first mission that I recall was that we were going to be the lead crew. I have never been as scared in my life because I had no experience. I really hadn't talked to anybody about how severe the conditions were. So while we were circling over the Assam Valley with our nose wheel down, and the pilot, he was told and he was going to do it. And so it was up to me to navigate. Suddenly another plane next to us had his nose wheel down. And so we put ours up so we could fly with that particular lead plane over the hump because they had had the previous experience.
The hump is actually the Himalayas.
Correct.
And what I think needs to be made clear to appreciate the danger you were in is that all these mountains were different shapes and different heights, and as you're flying along, sometimes you're flying blind. And next thing you know, there's an airplane, there's a mountain in front of you, and many airplanes were lost, not in battle, but just because of the conditions up there.
That's correct.
So you were fighting two different elements. You're fighting the elements of weather, and you're also fighting the elements of the Japanese fighters and
Well, I don't think that we expected to meet any Japanese in that area, and that's why they established the base in Chengdu, China, in far western. So our by far the primary concern was to get there. And they had radio at this base, so the radio operator could also be of some assistance to keep us on course. But yes, it was the conditions, or actually the reason we also went to India was because we were to get the bugs out of the airplane. And so we were the first B-29s in combat. And so this was a brand new airplane. No one had been to the Marianas yet. And so that was the thing, and that's where we lost a lot of our planes too. I can't tell you, but we had such things as runaway propellers, other mechanical failures, and I'm sure that there are some B-29s still laying up there somewhere.
by bugs you mean the elements of mechanical elements of the airplane that had never been tested in that kind of environment, and so you really didn't know what was going to go wrong.
That's correct. Or what might happen to a plane that had something wrong in its building in the first place.
The word guinea pig comes to mind somehow.
That's correct.
What were your missions? What were you supposed to be doing?
We were, besides China, and I can get into that a little more if you wish, but we flew in the Southeastern Asia area. We had such targets as Rangoon in Burma, Bangkok in Thailand, Singapore, and those were places that the Japanese were moving into, and we wanted to stop their advance.
So were you bombing, what were you bombing? What was the targets?
Well, one in particular I remember was a bridge in Bangkok to cut off, and there's a large river right there, and we wanted to cut off their transportation and supply as much as we could. Down in Singapore, they of course took that, the Japanese took that as a base of operations, particularly for their Navy. And I tell a story about the English, when they pulled out of Singapore, they left a dry dock in Singapore Harbor, and the Japanese moved in and they started using it. Our people in command took exception to that and said, we don't want them to use it, so we sunk it. And then a little bit later, very humorously, I think, the British sent us a bill for that dry dock, which we sunk.
Somehow, knowing the history of that period and the British during that time, I'm not surprised. You know, John, I think it's very important to note that you're bombing to stop the Japanese advance, and in actual fact, what the Japanese were doing were not only taking over most of Asia, but brutalizing the population, doing, as you probably didn't know at the time, but later you found out, horrific things to the men, women, and children of those areas. And so although what you were doing in terms of the bombing of these things to stop them may have seemed, you know, a terrible thing, you were stopping a group of people who were doing horrific things to the population. Would you say that after a while the missions became routine?
No, I wouldn't say so,
okay.
because some were much shorter than others. Rangoon was only a few hours away. Singapore, we had one mission that our crew was on all by itself as a photo reconnaissance mission. We were in that airplane 18 hours and 5 minutes. And we were on a photo mission, photo reconnaissance, and so we had no bombs. We had the camera. I don't know how we did the camera. That was the bombardier's job. but we took extra gasoline tanks in the bomb bays, and that's what permitted us to fly for that length of time.
John, I was very pleased that I was at the Michigan Company of Collectors and Historians group when you spoke there. Are there any particular incidents that you were able to bring up at that lecture that you could bring up now?
Well, the fun part was that particular photo reconnaissance, because we had stayed at rather low altitude all the way down the Malay Peninsula. We passed such places as Georgetown, or Penang, I think it was called in those days, and Kuala Lumpur. And so we knew that we had been seen, and that we would have a greeting party when we got to Singapore. And we were up at, I think, 30-some thousand feet. And sure enough, we had some friendly little fighter planes. They probably were Zeros, I'm not sure about that. But I looked out of my window and I actually saw one coming from our, you might say 8 o'clock direction. And I saw the bullets coming out of the wing. And so he wasn't very far away. We did get bullet holes in us, but no one was hurt. And we were all by ourselves. And once we completed the run for taking pictures of Singapore Harbor, that's when the pilot really put his pilot training into effect. Every time that he saw a plane coming direct on us, or from the front, he would turn right into that plane, because he had 4 50 caliber machine guns aiming right at him, and they would back off. And so, and they were at higher altitude than they should have been, because we could tell that they were kind of wavy at that altitude. And so it was a successful mission, but there was lots of activity.
Give me an idea of, I know that the gunners, of course, are shooting at the aircraft. The pilot is piloting. What does the navigator do in a situation like that?
Not very much, other than to keep, again, data. I was a gunner, but I didn't have a gun access to me from that turret that was right next to me. The man way in the back was controlling those 4 50 caliber machine guns. By the way, in the tail, we had a 20 millimeter cannon type.
So what other incidents that you can recall during this period of time?
Well, those, I would say, the missions in that particular area were okay, quite routine. China, that was a different matter.
Well, let's talk about China then.
The most significant mission ever that I was on in China, we took off from our base. I think it was perhaps just before dawn or around dawn, because we were headed for a target on Kyushu Island, which was across the Yellow Sea, I believe it is. And so once we got up to the altitude we were going to fly at, it was very unusual weather. There were high clouds above us. I could not see the sun to take a celestial shot of the sun. I couldn't see the ground. And by the way, the charts that we had were perhaps not all that reliable anyway. So I had to do the best I could with just plain dead reckoning. Well, first of all, it's very difficult when you've got clouds below us to even find out what your drift might be, how much the wind is putting you off the heading that you're at. But we continued on, and we finally broke out over the Yellow Sea, and we were supposed to rendezvous over an island off the south coast of Korea. We also were not supposed to break radio silence, but we finally did, because we didn't see anybody. And I'm not sure of whether we got some replies, but no one got together at the rendezvous point. It was a long mission, and so the flight engineer was considering our gas supply, and so we finally decided we'd better turn around and head back west. The same conditions still prevailed as far as my being able to do very good navigating. The radar operator, and I forgot to mention him as one of our crew members, was in the back, and he was reading on his radar, and he said, and I saw the same thing on my screen, what appeared to be some ships down in the water below us. And so we still had our bombs, and so we decided, well, okay, we're not going to meet up, we're not going to get to our target. Why don't we unload those bombs on those ships? We have never known whether we sunk anything or not. The significant part was that we could not get our bomb bay doors closed once we dropped the bombs. We then went to lower altitude so that the flight engineer could crawl out into the bomb bays and see what he could do about raising the doors, mechanically or whatever. He was unsuccessful. So we flew all the way back from the coast, all the way back toward Chengdu. Again, I couldn't do any better navigating in the afternoon than I did in the morning on the way over. Finally, when, I don't know what the range might have been, but then the pilot called upon the radio operator to call into the base that we were headed for. The base would take a fix on us. So by that, with his plotting and my plotting and the pilot being comfortable with that, we were successful. The flight engineer was watching the gauges very close, and finally we felt that we were in the area, and the pilot descended, and I think we were at between 300 and 500 feet when we broke out, and we were right on the runway, and we landed. The pilot was so skillful that he did not touch the bomb bay doors that were open. There's only about 18-inch clearance because of the type of landing we had as compared to a B-17. And right as we landed, 2 of our engines quit because they were out of gas. We then had to stay an extra day or 2 up at that base before they got the bomb bay doors closed or fixed.
John, for people who are not knowledgeable about this, there's a real chance of getting killed on that landing.
There are big mountains in that area of China, and this runway, it was only a single runway, was built with mountains, well, a few miles away, but if you can stray a couple miles very quickly. Yeah. And I don't recall anybody on that particular mission crashing upon coming back to that base.
You know, it's interesting, as I've interviewed radio operators, navigators, bombardiers, it's quite understandable why you would have such a great respect for the pilot that you work with. You have to have this absolute confidence, and then when he proves it over and over and over again, you know, I just can't imagine being in a situation where you know if he doesn't do it right, you're going to hit the ground and you're going to be dead, and yet he gets you in. There's got to be this sense of thanking. And
by the same token, every single person on that plane knew that he was the man in charge. So I tried it once.
Oh, really?
And we were just taking off, and we were climbing to altitude, and he was kind of zigzagging around, and I called him on my intercom, and I said, you know, I'd appreciate very much if you'd stay on one heading. And if I may use the vernacular, he said, well, any silly-ass navigator ought to be able to do that.
First and last time you questioned him?
Right.
Let's get a better idea of the individuals that you work with, not just in your crew, but was there a camaraderie amongst the whole group? Either, you know, off times or the barracks, or give us an idea more of the social aspects of
of course, they were very strong about maintaining separation between officers and enlisted men. I have to confess this, I don't think I've ever done this before, but one of the gunners, he and I became pretty good buddies. When we'd go out on a weekend in Calcutta, I would put a couple bars on his collar and took him along as an officer, which he was not. That was quite risky the more I think about it, but it never happened.
Yeah.
But so we had, if that answers your question about camaraderie, yes, we didn't, as a crew, we didn't make any distinction between officers and enlisted men. They were trained for their job, MOS or whatever was called for them to be enlisted men.
How big of an operation, this is in China we're talking about now, how big of an operation was this? How many airplanes? Give us an idea of the scope of it.
Well, in China, we only had tents as for sleeping. I don't even remember any other buildings there, but that's, and then when the pilot would say, well, we're going to have some time off, then perhaps we'd go into Chengdu. I think we went into Chengdu a couple times. But I'd say it was pretty extensive, but it was obviously temporary. Because I doubt if we left any permanent buildings once we moved out. There was a runway, and I don't think the runway was concrete. I think it was, couldn't have been coral, but they bulldozed out a landing strip for us.
Yeah. You know, we're looking at the 20th Air Force 58th Wing 468th Group. Was this the group that was there, or are we talking about, in China, are we talking about the 58th Wing was all there in the same place?
No, never a wing,
okay.
Perhaps not even a group. We were also then the 792nd Squadron.
Okay.
And I would say a squadron perhaps was 10 or 12. And so sometimes we'd go up as a squadron. Also, one thing that I think is worthwhile is that every bit of supplies that we used at that base had to be flown over the hump. There was no direct system of communication, obviously not a highway. And so gasoline was transported up there, gasoline that we didn't use. I mean, it was there for those who went out on a mission. I do recall seeing in some pictures I went over recently that there was one plane that had, I think, as many as 40 camels painted on the front. So that plane obviously was used primarily for the transport, but it was a B-29.
The supplies that came in, were they supplied by the Army Air Corps, or were there CNAC? As you know, there was a civilian airlines called CNAC that was out there.
To the best of my knowledge, it was all supplied by the Army,
okay.
Army Air Corps.
Okay.
There must have been a port that we had down close to Calcutta, and I know better how it worked when we got to the Marianas.
Right. Before we get there, you know, I've interviewed crews that were in Europe, and they talk about this armada of airplanes going over Germany and whatnot. But in your experience out there, it was always smaller groups. Is that accurate?
Only in India and China.
Okay. But then you move on to the Marianas.
We moved to the Marianas, I think it was in May of '45.
Before we get into that, John, did you have any, you know, in today's age of CNN and newspapers and internet and all that, you know, you could check out what the news is going on in Kuala Lumpur today. Was there any, did you have much of outside information about how the war was going, or?
No, I would say it was very scarce. We did, by the way, have one person of Japanese parentage who flew with us as a 12th crew member, only in India and China. His job was specifically to listen in on the radio to intercept Japanese messages and then relay them to the pilot or wherever he was instructed to do so. When we moved from India to the Pacific Islands, he suddenly disappeared. He didn't even have a chance to say goodbye to us, because the restrictions in those days were that no Japanese parentage could fly over the homeland. And so that particular aspect was not put into use when we were flying over the Pacific.
Mm-hmm. So he was a Japanese of American descent. He was,
Yes.
they call it, I think, sensei or something like that.
Yeah, Nisei.
Nisei, that's right. That's
And
right,
he
yeah.
was, he was definitely American. He had American citizen parents. I'm not sure whether he was born in the U.S. or where he was, but nice young man. We got along with him fine. We accepted him in our crew. We were all very disappointed when he suddenly was taken from us, and to the best of my knowledge, not a one of us was able to say goodbye to him. He just plain disappeared.
Let's move on to the Marianas. And first of all, did you get orders to go on a certain day or something like that? Or how did
Yes.
you actually get there?
Well, we knew well ahead of time that we were going to move because they moved most of the ground, or in fact, almost all of the ground personnel, they moved them by ship by way of Australia. So they left 30 days or more before our scheduled date of moving. And so, yes, we knew that we were going and we knew where we were going. Finally, we did all, I think, left the base in India at the same time. I think we landed in Kunming for refueling and then flew in the vicinity of the Philippines on our way to Tinian and Saipan.
Let me just interrupt you because, as you know, there's a personal interest here. In Kunming, did you spend any time there at all?
None,
Okay.
just for fueling.
Okay, so you had no contact with the 14th Air Force or any, okay.
No,
Now, was the fueling done by Chinese?
I think so. I think so, because they also had the Chinese constructing our bases. I recall seeing a runway in, I think it was China, that they were preparing it. They had bulldozed it and whatever, and then they were rolling it down, and they had this huge concrete rolling block, and they had, I don't know, perhaps as many as 40 Chinese people with ropes over their shoulders, and they dragged that huge thing to roll the runway. If somebody fell down, he fell down and the roller went over. That's where I did say that life was very cheap.
What was the purpose, or maybe you didn't know at the time, but what was the purpose of going to the Marianas?
Because all of the other B-29s had come directly from the States to Guam and Taipan, Tinian and Saipan. And the story that we got when we went over there is that they were going to begin what I think was General LeMay called a 90-day blitzkrieg. We got there in May and the war did end in August. And so it was very successful. And they did it because, of course, we also heard of troops that were on their way from Europe because the war there had ended or about ended, and so certain troops weren't needed, and they were on boats headed for the Pacific. And then when they found out that the air war was successful, and we had as many as between 500 and 600 planes at one time, B-29s, so that the production of B-29s was really accelerated after we left to go to India.
Let's get an idea of your arrival in the Marianas. This is the first time that you're in a huge operation like this, not just the smaller groups like you'd been in. What was the first mission like with that group?
Well, actually, we didn't feel that we were in a huge one because on Tinian, there were two operations, what we called the North Field, and at the North Field, that's where many of the B-29s that came directly from the States were located. They had 4 parallel runways, and they were down almost at sea level, and it was very convenient. And just a little aside, I always felt that once we moved out of Clark Airfield in the Philippines, that our Pacific base of operations would be on North Field because it was a tremendous facility. Of course, we had Anderson Air Force Base on Guam, and that's still there. So I think that later on, especially when they had to move out of Clark with the big volcano, They just abandoned that operation and didn't do any more about it. But anyway, the field that we who came from India were assigned to was just a single runway. And it was called West Field. And we had hard stands all along. I think we had perhaps 40 planes there, hard stands, because of all the ones that came from India. It was a rather tricky field, and it was a single runway, and at the end of the runway there was a big sand dune, I would assume it was, on an island. At least we had to make sure we got good speed and were climbing, but we just barely make it over that hill at the end of the runway, and then we could head down toward the water, because the water was just beyond the Pacific Ocean, and to pick up some speed before we'd really make our run around our course and head north.
What were these missions supposed to accomplish? What were you actually doing?
We were going to take out Japan, and to prevent to hopefully not have a land invasion be necessary.
I think it's important to make clear at this point, this is the island hopping, if you will, that the Marines and the military personnel on the ground were doing. So your job was to soften that area to make it safer for them. Is that accurate?
We were not involved in bombing Saipan or Tinian.
Okay.
In fact, when I got to Tinian, I had a person right here from Grand Rapids who was a Seabee, and he married my sister eventually. But he was over there building the runways. His job was on a jackhammer in the Seabees. He couldn't get in any service because he had bad eyesight, and they finally took him in the Seabees. That's just a little aside. But and we had nothing to do with the taking of Iwo Jima. That, of course, was a land invasion, and the Marines took that, and then they built a base, and that was the purpose of that. It was about halfway between the Marianas and the Japan mainland, and so that was a rescue type of place or emergency type of place when needed.
Two things quickly. What was the Seabee's name?
Gabe Heckman.
Okay, just for the record.
In Grand Rapids, he ended up being the top man at Heckman Furniture right here in Grand Rapids.
So what were if you weren't bombing these islands, what were your missions? What were you flying to?
All the way to Japan.
You were bombing Japan?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, they had done quite a bit of bombing before we got there. Like I say, we arrived in May, but I'm not sure when the first B-29s arrived on Guam or the Marianas.
What kind of opposition did you get in the air?
Very little. Very little. We once in a while, we'd have some fighter escort, but it was never needed as far as my judgment is concerned.
Was there a sense, John, that the war was winding down?
I think so. I think that they believed that they had pretty much caused the Japanese to retreat back to the homeland, and that's where their defense was going to be. So that, yes, I think that the higher-ups believed that air power would do it. And so that I believe they also just held off on any invasion because people were thinking that there could be a great loss of life. When you got close to Japan, they did have lots of anti-aircraft. We were not without being shot at. It's not that we didn't lose airplanes over Japan, that they would get shot up. And well, one of the planes that we had after we crashed our first one on Iwo Jima, then our second plane was shot up, and we were not on that plane. Some relief crew had taken it, and they ditched it in the Pacific Ocean.
Let's back up.
Okay.
You crash landed on Iwo Jima?
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
We were the lead crew, and I believe the mission was to Kobe, which is their best naval base. I've always felt that their naval anti-aircraft was far more effective than any land-based, whatever you want to call it. So we got shot up pretty good, and we were losing some fuel. The flight engineer was keeping good track of it. No one got hurt, by the way. And this was a daylight mission. And so we headed back for Tinian, and the pilot and the flight engineer, by the way, they were childhood buddies on the same street in St. Petersburg. So they were discussing between each other as to, can we make it all the way back or can't we? Flight engineer said no, he didn't think so. Well, obviously he would have to be on the conservative side because that was, again, his job. Pilot really wanted to go back. Well, the decision finally was made, and they were buddies, and so they decided to go into Iwo Jima because that's what it was there for. And there were other planes going in, we knew that. And just before we arrived there was a sudden downpour, just a local thunderstorm, you might say. Well, the runway had only been very recently constructed, all made out of coral. And so when this downpour came, it really dampened that runway to make it very slick. The pilot, he went in, but once he hit the ground, he could not control the speed of the plane. The brakes didn't work, and we finally slid. I'm not sure how far ahead of us the water was at the end, but we eventually kind of hooked a tree and fell off to the side of the runway. It was in bulldozing, they had created some big embankments, and that's where we then went in nose first, and the front end of the plane was pretty much damaged. I used my seatbelt, and all of us did except the bombardier because he was right in the nose. So the bombardier did get bounced around. The pilot didn't want him up there. The bombardier was bounced around, and he had some injury to vertebrae. So they took him off the plane, and he eventually ended up at the hospital in Guam. We went to see him there, but he didn't see any more combat after that. And I've seen him since then. He's a retired Methodist minister in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, the home of Rush Limbaugh.
So did you got a replacement for him then?
Yes.
So now you have an experienced crew with a new guy.
Right.
How did that play?
I don't recall any incident that he was not a good substitute. He was a farmer in New Mexico. I've never been able to contact him again, but that went fine. Then I was taken off the crew for a short time and assigned to another crew on Iwo Jima, and I think I flew about 4 missions that we called air-sea rescue, in which we would fly from Iwo. Of course, we were not bombing or anything, and we'd get right down 500 feet off the water and zigzag all the way across Tokyo Bay looking for any Navy pilots or any other kind of people that might be in distress. We couldn't get down and rescue them. We didn't have any drop chutes or anything. But it would be my job to locate their exact location for submarines to go in or surface craft. I do recall that when we were making the zigzag that I saw guns on the shore pointed right straight out at them. I could see the smoke go up, but it wasn't effective.
After your sea rescue operation, where did you go from there?
Went back to my own crew back on Tinian. I don't know the reason why I was needed, but that's where my assignment was. And I'm not sure if the crew flew other missions while I was gone. It was very brief.
The battles that were on Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal, of course, are part of our history now. Did you have any idea about the carnage that went on there? I mean, was there any information given to you? Did you know how badly those battles were fought?
Oh, yes, yeah. And there was still talk about there being Japanese military people in the hills.
Yeah.
And over on Saipan, well, they found some of them that were there years later and didn't know the war was ever over.
I was a kid in the 1960s. A guy crawled out of somewheres, and he
Yeah.
still thought the war was on.
That's right. We were privileged to take a tour back to the Marianas in 1973. Both my brother-in-law Gabe Heckman and I. It was our 25th wedding anniversary. So we took our wives with us, and we went over, and we spent a whole week in the Marianas. Wow. And they invited us over to Tinian. They didn't have any facilities over there, but they gave us a big spread. They used a parachute for the canopy over our, and then we stayed in a big hotel on Saipan at a very interesting time. Yeah. But then our wives could actually see where we had been. Yeah. But by 25 years later, why it was built up, a lot of hotels built on Saipan. We could still see tanks out in the water.
Wow. As the war started to come to a close, you're still part of the bombing of Japan. When did you get, or not when, but what was your reaction when you heard that the A-bomb had been dropped?
We were very surprised because it was right on the same island we were on. The Enola Gay was on Tinian. There never was any scuttlebutt or anything that there was a plane there that was going to do great things. And they must have been flying out of Northfield, not out of our one runway base. And they must have been taking off, doing a lot of practicing and stuff. And the word never got to us that there was one plane that was doing something special. And so we didn't know about it, and the Enola Gay wasn't back to our island yet, and we did know about it.
How did you find out?
Just through communications by radio or whatever, and the word got around very quickly. And then, of course, how many days was it? 5 or 6 days before the second one. And that didn't surprise it, but the war still didn't end. And so we actually flew a regular, our type of mission after August 14. Wow. Before they finally said, okay, we'll give in.
What was I realize it's a long time ago, but this is such an amazing event. What was the reaction for you as well as the people around you when you knew the war is over?
Then we all started checking on how many points we had to be redeployed. And that went by how many missions we had, what kind of medals we got, how long we had been in the service. As I recall, my count was 85, and that qualified for us the war was over in August, and we were on our way in October.
So how did you get home?
With a B-29. We flew our own B-29 back. We landed on Kwajalein, and then we landed in Hawaii, and then to Mather Air Force Base in California. That's where we were separated. But we had not only our crew, and again, I didn't have to navigate on that. The pilot let me sit up in the bombardier's seat, so I had the bird's eye view. But besides our own crew, we took about, I think maybe as many as 10 other personnel, land personnel, office, maintenance, whatever. I don't remember who they were. I still have, I have my 201 file, and I still have the list of all of the people who were on that flight.
What was the emotional environment when you were separating from the crew? Did you guys just walk off, or was there shaking of hands, or were there?
Well, we had to go through a process. There's always paperwork with the military.
No, I mean just your crew itself, and the final goodbye. I mean, was it just something you just walked off the job, or did you say goodbye to them, or what happened?
Oh yeah, we said goodbye. They gave us a choice of wanting to stay in on active duty or wanting to join the reserves or just out. Most of our particularly our enlisted men, they wanted out. I decided to say, well, okay, I think I'll hang on to my reserve, because my philosophy was that there were 25 years between World War I and World War II. we had quite a few people that we ran into that were World War I veterans, and they maintained their commission. So my thought was, I don't want to start over again if that happens, if that repeats itself. And so I wanted to keep my wings and my commission. So I stayed in the reserves. And the pilot, he didn't have any other skills, frankly. And so he stayed in as an active duty. He ended up doing some work in the Pentagon, and he was here and there. The radio operator stayed in for a while, and the tail gunner. But most of the rest of the people, including both the bombardier, whom I said we met up with later, and the flight engineer, and the co-pilot, all were separated from the service on a permanent basis.
So you're in the reserves, so what does that mean? Do you still stay in California, or where'd you go from there?
No, I went home, and I went back to Calvin College.
Well, when you go home, you're now returning home from war. Let's talk about coming home, your sisters, your mother and father. Give us an idea what that was like.
Well, we ended up at McClellan. We were transferred from one base to another right in California in the Sacramento area. And that's where we were officially separated. But it was very, very difficult to get any kind of transportation because the trains and everything were coming out of San Francisco, and they were full by the time they got to where we were. So we were able to get, the co-pilot and I were able to get a flight up to Spokane, Washington. The co-pilot had relatives in Seattle, and so that's where he was headed. So we decided, well, we'd just get out of the San Francisco area. Then in Spokane, I signed up and got on a train, a Pullman train, and I took it all the way to Chicago. It had a sleeper and everything. And actually in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, we picked up some Navy nurses. Why the Navy was in Coeur d'Alene, I don't know. But so it was an interesting trip all the way back to Chicago. And then in Chicago, I got out to Capital Airlines at I think it was not Megsfield, the Midway Airport. Got a flight up there to Grand Rapids, and happened to meet a young lady on that plane who lived in the same neighborhood that my home was. And I hadn't told anybody at home, because when I called them from California, I couldn't give them a date at all. And then we were busy and this and that, so then I didn't know how I was going to get home. Anyway, I was on this plane from Chicago to Grand Rapids, and this young lady said that her father was coming to pick her up, and they'd be glad to take me home. And they lived on the same street. So they stopped, it was in the evening.
It's all right, John.
And they stopped and let me off, and I walked in the door.
And they saw you in uniform, and you were alive, and you had both arms, and
Right.
oh, that must have been a wonderful experience.
Right.
Get lots of hugs?
Oh, yeah. And my brother, who had been in the service before me, he came home after I did, although he had left about a year before I did. But his is a long, different story.
Sure. So that must have been a reunion, too, when
Yes.
he came home.
Yes.
So actually, the whole family survived the
Right.
experience.
Right. Yes, my brother was married while he was in the service. And he went to infantry and then to the Air Corps, washed out of the Air Corps, and then combat engineers.
Wow. So while you're back home then, you had some time, in terms of the reserves at that time, you would then be able to get a job doing whatever you want, and then if they called you up, you would be called back into the service? Is that
I
how-
was on what they called the Ready Reserve, but I got home in October, but it was too late for the fall semester. So I fussed around or did my thing. I went to visit my buddy from New Jersey who had been at Hope College, visited him in that meantime, and then I went back to Calvin in January for the second semester. And then I finished 2 years beyond the end of that semester. Got married that summer. We finished college. But the reserves were very unorganized, and so I didn't hear anything from them. Then I think it was while I was living in Ann Arbor, I got a letter that, well, you either have to do something or get out. So then I did what was assigned. I went to a 2-week tour of duty. I could attend meetings that would give me, every meeting I attended, I got a point. I needed to get 35 points in a year to keep me on reserve status. I never got called back to Korea or anything. Where I worked, they all really kidded me because Eisenhower had some to do off of the coast of Lebanon in the Mediterranean. Oh, they were all razzing me that I was surely going to go to that. But it never happened. And so I got finished. I went on then to Ann Arbor and then got a job down in the South Chicago area. And I joined a reserve outfit there. It actually happened to be in Gary, Indiana. But then I was able to transfer over to O'Hare because they had a flying unit there. And so then I would go on tours of duty to Bermuda a few times, or the Panama Canal Zone or something like that. And then in 1958, they took me off of flying status. I guess they had, well, that must have been what, I was 35 then, I guess. And but I had a secondary MOS, and that was a finance officer because my degree from Michigan was in accounting.
Yeah, I guess we're going to close here, but what did you go to Calvin for? What was the...
I actually got a degree in education. My wife was a school teacher, and I was interested in education. I was headed really for secondary school, and I had practice teaching in history.
No.
And but then, as things worked out, when I finished Calvin, then I thought we were going to get a job to run a small school up north here in Grant, Michigan. And something happened, and so then I finally said, okay, if that's the way it works out, I'm going to Michigan to get my master's degree. After that, then having it in business administration, I headed for business. And in the Chicago area is where we ended up, because my wife was from Iowa, and we thought this would be a good place to settle halfway between.
Sure. And just for your kids and grandkids and all that, tell us about meeting this young lady. How did you meet your future wife?
In one of the semesters, I don't know which one it was, but I signed up for a psychology class. That particular professor, and this happened in the military every once in a while too, would arrange us by alphabetical order. So my name began with F, and her last name began with G. So she sat right next to me. And then I was still a Michigan football, was a Michigan football fan, and in those days when all of the guys came back from the war, it behooved the colleges to have classes not only on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for a regular 3-hour class, but they also were having them on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I didn't like Saturday classes, and I wanted to go to the football game, so I asked this young lady to take the notes for me. The rest is history.
I'm going to have the opportunity at some time to meet your wife, and I'm going to ask her if that's the actual story.
I have to correct something.
Oh.
She passed away 2 years ago
I'm sorry.
with Alzheimer's.
Okay.
I have a different wife now that I've been married to exactly 1 year.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But the young lady I met in college, we married almost 54 years.
Wow, that's wonderful. Just wonderful.
But she was sick since 1988, and but we still did a lot of traveling, courtesy of the Air Force. We could fly anywhere in the world that the Air Force would fly us. So I've always been grateful for those opportunities and glad that we took them when we were able to.
Yeah. Yeah. John, I also want to, just for the record, there's not that many people of your generation that could still fit into his uniform. And just so that everybody in the audience knows, this is not something you picked up at the Army-Navy store somewhere. This is the actual uniform of the Air Force.
Yes.
I thank you so much, sir. This has been a great honor to meet you and to talk to you.
You're very welcome.